In the 2012 presidential election, the opposition ran with Enrique Capriles. First of all, 81% of people went voting, and Chavez won again with 55%. And in our investigation about poverty and support for Chavez, you see that the banana shape becomes still a little stronger, meaning there is now definitely a trend whereby the poor and rural parishes support Chavez more strongly. But look at this in more detail. The problem with this fact is, again, politicization. So the rhetoric of the government paints a picture where it itself represents el pueblo humilde, the economically humble, popular and working classes, and the term middle class is almost an insult. On the other side, it portrays the opposition as representing only the oligarchy, a rich, powerful, white, urban economic elite. Now you can look at this data and see exactly that. But you can also look at this data and see that actually this banana is very fat. Except for this part here, it's still more like a cloud at this end, with parishes with fairly little poverty supporting Chavez or not, and districts with a lot of poverty supporting Chavez or not. So while this trend exists, it's not true that there exist two clearly identifiable classes.
But these elections proved to be Chavez's last victory, because he died in March 2013 after a 2-year-long struggle with cancer.
A las 4:25 de la tarde de hoy 5 de marzo ha fallecido el comandante presidente Hugo Chávez Frías.
Chavez had expressly wished that his old companion Nicolás Maduro assumes his legacy and continues his political project.
The question has ever since been whether Maduro can hold Chavismo together. Remember that Chavez's power ended up resting on two principal pillars: his past and influence in the military, and his power more and more over the civilian administration. Of these two, Maduro is a person from the civilian side of Chavismo, and whether or not he can bridge the gap over to the military will determine his political fate.
Maduro had to run against Capriles again in 2013. Again, 80% of people went voting. Maduro won by a very narrow margin of 1.5% or 225,000 votes, but he was now president. The two most important people managing the power split inside Chavismo are thus President Maduro and the Speaker of Parliament, Diosdado Cabello. To simplify the matter slightly, Maduro is the civilian and Cabello is the military. As long as they hold together, Chavismo will probably hold together as well. About our investigation about poverty and support for Chavismo, Maduro's election reflected a general decline in support across the board.
Most election observers verified that the vote was fair, and opinion polls before the elections mostly indicated that Maduro would win. But the opposition nevertheless didn't accept the results.
Nosotros no vamos a reconocer un resultado hasta tanto aquí no se cuente cada voto de los venezolanos.
They accused the government of intimidation and identity theft. Later the same year, they also identified 200,000 dead people still listed in the voting register. We ourselves know such cases. So in effect, the opposition didn't recognize Maduro as president.
In reaction, Speaker Cabello didn't allow them to speak in parliament and removed the microphones from their seats.
En esta Asamblea Nacional, mientras yo sea presidente, no tendrá derecho de palabra ningún diputado que no reconozca al compañero Nicolás Maduro. No le voy a dar el derecho de palabra, pueden meterse donde quieran, vayan a declarar en Globovisión, pero aquí no van a tener derecho de palabra. Si no reconocen a Nicolás, no reconocen las instituciones, aquí en esta asamblea no tienen derecho de palabra. Si quieren se paran y se
Then the opposition started to disrupt proceedings and unfurled a banner, "Coup against Parliament." Now some Chavista deputies assaulted them and a brawl ensued.
The context of all of this, again, is the power accumulated in the executive and the highly politicized state that this brings with it.
In this case, it started at least with how Chavez used his influence over the Electoral Council to delay the recall referendum in 2003 and 2004. It's exactly power politics like this that pull formerly impartial institutions into politics and make them untrustworthy in the eyes of society.
The function impartial and institutionalized arbiters should fulfill in society, like an independent judiciary and a functioning police force, or in this case, an independent electoral council, is exactly that of the neutral referee in this boxing match, to control and impose basic limits to conflict, because otherwise there is no logical limit to how far conflict can escalate.
Sharky Raymond is now fighting with one of the cornermen. The fight will have to win. Sharky Raymond throwing everything. Bernie Hall is now throwing punches. There are other people in the ring. There must be 20 people in the ring. Punches flying everywhere. Where will this end?
Conflicts exist in every society, be they small conflicts between neighbors, normal crime and violence, or conflicts between political parties. And that's exactly also the background behind last year's protests. In functioning democratic societies, we rightfully cherish and celebrate the right to freedom of assembly and to free expression. But we shouldn't ignore that having large-scale protests is a sign of democratic failure. People do not take to the street just for fun, but rather when they think that normal, formal, institutionalized politics won't represent them.
The protests last year originally swelled up in January to demonstrate the high levels of insecurity in Venezuela. These were organized mainly by student organizations in Mérida and Táchira. However, it was on Venezuela's National Youth Day, the 12th of February 2014, that things really kicked off. Parts of the political opposition joined in and the protesters called for the resignation of the government. They claimed that the election was fraudulent and rallied around the soaring crime rate, record high inflation, scarcity of essential goods, and corruption.
El día de mañana, 12 de febrero, damos otro paso hacia la consolidación de este movimiento popular, de esta fuerza de cambio. Te invitamos, hermana, te invitamos, hermano, a que salgas con mucha fuerza, a que salgas con toda la convicción de saber que Venezuela puede y tiene que estar mejor.
In clashes with the police, these protests then turned violent and led to more than 2 months of continuous protests, street blockades, and wider social unrest, with well-substantiated allegations of excessive police brutality against protesters and journalists. However, there have been deaths on both sides of the political spectrum, especially around the street blockades, the so-called guarimbas. 2 important leaders who wanted to pressure the government out of office were Leopoldo López and María Corina Machado. This gave them considerable political capital, especially López. Notable was that Capriles didn't support the protests, while affirming that they did have the right to protest. So this showed a split in the opposition between Capriles' camp, who believe they need to win at the ballot box, and the López and Machado camp, who think the government is illegitimate and should be forced out of office through protest and civil disobedience. In turn, again, the Chavista camp is mostly divided between military and civil leaders. And here the most important two are President Maduro and Speaker Cabello. So in summary, an economic crisis in the 1980s led to a reaction by a social democratic government by Acción Democrática, which initiated the wholesale replacement of Venezuela's 2 old political parties, Acción Democrática and COPEI, in the 1990s. We've seen how Chavez took power in a time when Venezuelan politics was in flux and the opposition disorganized. How he pushed his Bolivarian revolution where he could and remodeled the Venezuelan state around his person. How informal and formal opposition forces tried to oppose him but to no avail. And how the highly politicized state he passed on still today causes Venezuelan politics to be a messy, confrontational and unproductive process.